My name is Jeff Gebben with American Purpose. This is a participant-intensive roundtable book discussion with an important author, book, and moderator. So welcome to all of you. You have lots to do and many Zoom invitations in your box. So thank you for being available this hour. Hard stop, 1 p.m. Eastern. Please, if you don't read, watch, listen, follow American Purpose, give us a look. If you're new to us, pardon me, Michelle will put a link in chat. Thank you, Carla Robbins, a member of our editorial board. Carla needs no introduction, but deserves one. She is teaching, a professor at Baruch College, New York. She is with the Council on Foreign Relations. She's had a distinguished career as a journalist, as a writer, as a public intellectual, including stints at the Wall Street Journal and in the editorial leadership of the New York Times. Great to see you, Carla, and thanks for leading and managing this conversation with Tom Main, also a professor teaching, lecturing at Baruch College in New York. Tom, you are a book writer and you are a public intellectual, and you put out 2021, in my view, a very valuable book, Brookings Press, The Rise of Illiberalism. How can we get tired of this topic when this topic is present, persistent, and nagging at us every day? And we can't have enough deep analysis to understand the roots of the problem and what we're up against. I could say more about the book, but I liked it and I won't. And I'm going to turn it over to you and Carla. And Carla, you have the floor. Lead us forward, please.
Jeff, thank you so much. And it's so great to see everyone here. And Tom, who actually has an office, we have offices down the hall from each other, but I'm not sure I've seen you in months and months and months. So it's lovely to see you, if only virtually. So Thomas J. Main is a professor at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College, CUNY, and an author of several books. Before the Rise of Illiberalism, he wrote also for Brookings, The Rise of the Alt-Right. And Tom and I have been talking about this work. It's sort of an extraordinary, both works are extraordinary works and very important, very much on top of the news, but also, have deep theory and also pretty good political science behind them. So I want to talk both about the theory and the politics of it, but I also want to talk about the methodology behind it. So we're going to do all of those things today. Okay. Tom and I are going to chat for a little bit, and then we're going to throw it open to questions. If you have questions that arise at the moment, please just put them in chat or raise your hand, and this will help me sort of shape my questions as well as I'll throw them open to everybody here. So Tom, I know what we mean when we talk about illiberal democracies. I do have a PhD in political science, which my mother made me do before I became a journalist. But what is illiberalism itself? Can you give us a definition? You say that it's both, it's a philosophy, but also a strategy in the book. So can we start with that? What is it? And can you give us some examples?
Sure. Okay, illiberalism is both a political ideology and a rhetorical strategy that kind of grows logically out of that ideology, okay? So in one sense, illiberalism is purely, you could define it negatively. It is the rejection of liberal democracy, any of the principles of liberal democracy in whole or in part, right? So therefore, and what are the principles of liberal democracy? We're talking about the basic concepts that were sketched out by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence: political equality, all people are created equal; human rights; electoral democracy, the government derives its power from the just consent of the governed; the rule of law. Those are the essential political principles of liberal democracy. And what's also implicit in the way Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence is a rhetoric, an ethics of controversy that is tolerant, that doesn't demonize opponents, that focuses on reason and fact-based discourse. So that's liberal democracy. Illiberalism is the rejection of any of those elements. So for instance, maybe if you had to sum up illiberalism in one concept, it would probably be all people, all men are not created equal. And example, that is said very explicitly at places like the American Renaissance, which is an alt-right website. The author, the editor of that site, makes a career going around saying all men are created equal is gauzy bunk. It's a form of insanity. It's nonsense, right? And therefore, all forms of political inegalitarianism, like anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, all that is illiberalism. Right? And I could go on, and a rejection of any one of the principles of liberal democracy is illiberal. But also, and I'll say this and then I'll keep my comment brief. Also, out of that ideology arises a rhetorical strategy. Okay, the ideology holds that politics is war, literal war, right? And that your adversaries are traitors, okay? If you believe that, then discourse becomes not an effort to persuade other people, but to attack other people. And so the associated with growing out of the illiberal ideology is an intolerant, extremist ideology that focuses on, well, you could look at the style book for one of the most extreme and notorious illiberal sites, the Daily Stormer. Somebody actually got a copy of the magazine style book, and it says explicitly things like, we really do want to gas the kikes. And it also got on to say our editorial policy is the more exaggeration, the better. We want to dehumanize other people to the extent that our readers are willing to laugh at the idea that they're going to, our opponents will die, right? So, and what's interesting about the rhetorical strategy is in situations where it's not prudent to step forward and say explicitly, I'm against electoral democracy, all people are not created equal, where you can't do that, where you're trying to reach a larger audience, you express your ideology through the rhetorical strategy. And this is how illiberal ideas seep down into Fox News and ultimately the Trump White House.
So that stuff sounds pretty wackadoodle, which is, of course, a technical term. I mean, it's sort of hard to take it seriously. It's it's like, a style book that says, we really do hate the kikes. I mean, it's it's hard to take this stuff seriously. Yeah. And before we get on to your methodology, which shows that actually we do have to take it seriously, can we talk a little bit about the illiberal platforms and the practitioners that are the most influential? Because the list that you come up with, it's not just the Daily Stormer. You've got some names here that are actually a little bit more, mainstream sounding names that actually use a lot of this language. Obviously, Breitbart, everybody knows Breitbart, and Breitbart, became more of a mainstream as the mainstream shifted really hard right over the previous administration. So who are some of the practitioners of this?
Well, now you're right that there's like a hardcore, and then there's kind of what might be called an illiberalism light. So Breitbart is like the illiberalism light in that it avoids explicitly rejecting the principles of liberal democracy and communicates its illiberalism in the illiberal rhetorical strategy. And it says things like Tony Benn should be beheaded and have his entrails ripped out. The Democrats are the party of plunder and the party of treason and so forth. So that's Breitbart. And of course, as we know, Steve Bannon was the editor of Breitbart, and he left to become an advisor with Donald Trump on Trump's campaign, and he was briefly on the National Security Council, if you can imagine that.
Statutorily on the National Security Council.
Yes. And he did say, and by the way, it's very important to get this quote pretty much exactly correct. He said, Breitbart is the platform of the alt-right, not a platform, the platform. So that's one personality. And of course, Bannon was, eventually kicked out of the Trump administration, but continues to be a hanger-on and an illiberal activist. Let's see, I guess you could also look at Greg Johnson, who is the editor of a platform called Countercurrents Publishing. He's got a PhD in political theory. He has a very philosophical site. He is extremely influenced by Carl Schmitt, right? The Nazi political theorist who advanced the concept, which is fully adopted by liberals, that politics is all about friend versus foe, which is to say politics is war. There's Jared Taylor, who's been around for a long time. He publishes The American Renaissance. That used to be a hard copy publication, started back in the 90s. Didn't really go anywhere until, and this is something that's true of the alt-right in general, the thing that helped the movement take off, not only the alt-right, but illiberalism in general, is, before digital media, they were confined to print media, which was expensive and they didn't get much of an audience. And when these publications, another example would be VDare, right? When they got onto the internet, right, all of a sudden they found an inexpensive way to reach a mass audience and to do it without any gatekeepers editing the content. And so all of these figures, Johnson, Bannon, Jared Taylor, their fortunes really changed around the turn of the millennium when digital media came into existence.
So in your book, though, you also list people like Ann Coulter and Michelle Malkin and Buchanan and Tucker Carlson as part of this. They're not the Daily Stormer, right, although if you listen really closely, one begins to hear echoes of this. How do you end up putting them in a similar basket? Is it because they somewhat publish on similar platforms, or because it's the rhetoric, or how do you end up putting them together?
Well, as I say, I think it's very important to understand that liberal democracy has these particular political principles that we're all very familiar with. Political egalitarianism, human rights, electoral democracy, rule of law, etc. But also essential to liberal democracy is a controversy of ethics that is based in tolerance. And you can see that in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. He talks about how the British are his friends up until the point of war. He presents evidence, and he says, let me present the following evidence to a candid world. Okay, so and Jefferson tries to reach out and work with ideas and assumptions that he shares with the British, which is Lockean political philosophy. So anyhow, the point is this: integral to liberal democracy is this a political culture based on tolerance, an ethics of controversy based on reasoned debate. Now, as I say, you ask, well, how can you possibly say that somebody like Ann Coulter is illiberal in the same way that the Daily Stormer is? Well, it's not illiberal in exactly the same way. What Ann Coulter does is she focuses on just the rhetoric. She adopts the idea that politics is war, and her rhetoric sounds that way. And excuse me while I just want to check a quote that I've got here from Ann Coulter, which I think is highly relevant, kind of sums things up. She wrote a book called How to Speak to a Liberal If You Must. And one of her pieces of advice is, you must outrage the enemy. If the liberal you're arguing with doesn't become speechless with sputtering, impotent rage, you're not doing it right. Nothing too extreme can be said about liberals because it's all true. Right? Now, look, that is, that could have passed, but would have been approved by somebody working with the Daily Stormer's a style book. Okay, it's just that it doesn't use nasty words, well, or the most nasty words. to refer to Jews and minorities and such. But that kind of rhetoric and the concepts behind it, that is how it makes sense to talk about an ideology with and a food chain with an elite, which of course I'm not using in an honorific term, but just a relatively small group of people. They come up with the hardcore ideas, right? From that spins off a rhetorical strategy, and then that is capable of being disseminated by people who are still trying to publish in mainstream publications like Ann Coulter and like Fox News, etc. So so there's this continuum of a food chain, an illiberal food chain, and that's how these writers, some of whom are more explicitly extreme than others, that's why you can put them all in the same group and classify them as illiberal.
So you also talked about, and I want to get to the methodology in which you actually measured the influence of these groups, but you also talked about this intrinsic to this as well as this sort of inversion and victimology perception.
Yes.
Can you talk about that? So it's not just declaring that, you know, it's the war of all against all against politics, but there's also this, and I don't know if this is sort of intrinsic to the identitarian movement and this replacement theory, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, you know, let's see if I can put this correctly. The illiberal movement has made a raid on certain forms of left-wing and postmodern thought and stolen some of their concepts and repurposed them for illiberal goals. So there was a school of feminist political thought known as a feminist standpoint methodology. And very briefly, the idea, and this idea was shared by other schools of thought besides feminism, the idea was, you know, it kind of asked the question like that Descartes asked, you know, how do we begin our inquiry? Where do we start? And feminist standpoint methodology said, oh, start from the standpoint, from the assumptions of marginal groups, outsiders to mainstream society. And they considered women to be marginalized in that sense from mainstream society, which was dominated by men. But the standpoint methodology privileged the status of women and minorities and sexual minorities and eventually even people like criminals and people who are insane, because why? Oh, you see, they have critical distance on the mainstream. And if you're stuck in the mainstream, you can't understand, you know, its contradictions and its weaknesses. So you got to start your inquiry from the standpoint of the marginal group. Right. Fine, okay. Then one day somebody said, hey, wait a second. If you're supposed to start your inquiry from the standpoint of marginal groups, and if you're actually supposed to incorporate marginal groups into your discourse on the ground that they have this critical distance, doesn't that mean that we have to facilitate and start our inquiry from the point of view of Nazis? Oops, yeah, that's a problem with advising people to start from the margins, isn't it? You can end up privileging marginal groups that you really didn't want to privilege. And so what happened is these illiberals, who were not directly influenced by the feminists, they were influenced by other figures like Marxe and others. They said, hey, you know what? We're going to paint ourselves as the people who are really, really, really marginal. We're going to expose women and Jews and minorities. We'll expose them as phony, dummy marginal groups that have in fact really been incorporated in the mainstream. We will be the really marginal group, and that will prove to us, at least, right, that we have critical distance. We are the movement that's capable of understanding society and changing it, right? And so but then the next question is this: well, if you're a white male and you're not in one of these minority groups, how do you prove that you're marginal? Answer: use the most insulting, nasty rhetoric you can, which will force people to do things like gasp in amazement and burst into tears, and so people will react to you, and they will treat you like you're marginal, and that's what you want. So whatever you think of this argument that I just spun, the brief point is the illiberal movement has stolen the glorification of marginality from the postmodern movement, and they are celebrating and reveling in being the most marginal group you can possibly imagine. And who's that? Answer: Nazis, fascists, racists, etc. So that turns all those nasty points of view into something positive, and sort of strengthens the spine of the illiberals.
You don't really have to be an intellectual to do this. I mean, the whole replacement theory is we're getting marginalized because all those black and brown people are taking over, and all those women are taking over, and all those gay people are taking over, and all those people who don't speak good English are taking over, and all this other stuff. I mean, you don't have to know who Marcuse is to feel like this notion of that we're being marginalized in our own country.
Just very basically, I mean, I think it's very important to understand, the way ideas have an influence in politics. Up again, let's call it a food chain, although there's problems with that analogy. At the very top, there are experts, right, who are ginning out complicated ideas that attempt to, they're the best attempt that society makes to try to understand the reality, social reality, right? So they come up with these ideas which are not suitable for mass dissemination, right? Underneath the experts, you have intellectuals, which Hayek famously called secondhand dealers in ideas. They take the concepts of the experts and they boil them down into public ideas, slogan-like concepts. So you can go from standpoint methodology, right, which privileges marginality. You go from that to talking about the Great Replacement, or the Jews will not replace us, or whatever. So these ideas that are developed by most of them are not experts, but you have a group of intellectuals that develop the ideas in their full complexity, right? And then the ideas get simplified into public ideas, right? Slogans, which are suitable for dissemination in mass media. And so these ideas trickle down. And so, yes, eventually you don't have to be an intellectual to be influenced by these ideas, because there's this long food chain, this long ladder of being that connects the experts who are developing the ideas with the man and woman on the street.
So we've got just a few more minutes of me dominating the conversation with you, and I want to throw it open to everyone, but can we talk about your methodology for a minute? Sure. And Tom and I spent a lot of time talking about methodology anyway, because Tom has taught me how to be a thesis advisor at Baruch. So we have these conversations all the time. So a key part of your work on the alt-right and now in this book is actually seeking to measure the reach and influence of groups and ideas. And so you crunched web traffic, which is something as a former editor of a digital page at a newspaper, I'm very happy to hear about this. So can you tell, you looked at the web traffic for the first 11 months of 2019 to about 2 dozen websites across the political spectrum. Yes. And particularly you looked at 215 right-wing illiberal sites. Yes. And so can you talk, how you chose those illiberal sites and what you found? Okay, so first of all, the way I identified illiberal sites was one, a number of them boldly step forward and say, "Hi there, we're neo-Nazis. Hello, we're with the KKK." So you can look at the sites that are self-identified, and you can also look at sites that are identified by research organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League. And then there are also kind of encyclopedia pages like right-wing versions of Wikipedia, which also identify some of these sites. So then you go to those sites and you look at their blog rolls and their links lists, right? And now you have to pour through them because some of the links are not relevant. But anyhow, from all that material, right, I was able to identify the 215 hardcore illiberal right sites. And then
it turns out there's a media watchdog organization, Media Bias Fact Check. And what they do is they bring in reviewers to look at all sorts of websites, and then they classify the websites ideologically from the mainstream left to the mainstream right, through to center right, center left, and so forth. So you end up, therefore, with these approximately 2,000 websites that are categorized ideologically, all right? And then it's pretty simple to get the web traffic data, the firms that will sell that to you. And so then you count, right? And when you count, what do you find? You find that the 215 hardcore illiberal right sites get, in that period that you just mentioned, about 186 million visits on average a month. Okay, now, but so is that a lot or is that a little? Well, that's where you compare them to the other visits to sites of other ideologies. So, for instance, if you look at at conventional right sites, so this is the National Review, this is Commentary, this is the old-fashioned right wing that we're all familiar with. Those sites got about 604 million visits on average a month. So the hardcore liberal sites are getting about 30% of the audience that the mainstream right gets. And the hardcore illiberal right also gets about 19% of the audience that the mainstream left gets. Hey, that's a significant bunch of people. Okay, that is not chump change, right? So and then the other thing that's good about this methodology, if somebody says, yeah, but prove to me that you really should be worried about these sites having such a considerable audience. Well, what you can then do is go and you can look at the material that is posted on those sites, and then you simply pull out representative and juicy quotes, and voila, you have demonstrated that some extremely nasty ideologies have a very significant audience on the internet, which is perhaps the major form of mass communication in the early 21st century. Now, I see, Jeffrey, I see your hand up. Should I call on you?
That's my job, but yes, you can call on him too.
That's Carla's job.
Please.
You two run the conversation.
Okay, fine. Yeah,
when you're ready.
Go ahead. Keep going, Carla. Keep going.
Jeff is our noble leader. Please, Jeff, go for it.
I didn't mean it as an interruption. I was actually going to get into the queue. Sorry for that.
You're in the queue, and we're very happy to have you. And anything that has to do with web traffic is obviously a good conversation here.
Well, so thank you, Carla. Thank you, Tom. I have three questions. Let me ask one. I see, good heavens, Avi Tucker and Arch Puddington, Paul Stebbins, Patrick Charmel. I will not ask three. I will not ask two. I'll ask one. Tom, as you and Carla were speaking, and a couple names came up illustrative of a problem at hand, Tucker Carlson and Coulter. Let's stipulate that ideology and political vision and values play a central role. I want to ask you about two other factors potentially contributing, and one is our model of commerce and the profit motive, and our culture that holds with a very high value celebrity and markets outrage. So in 2016, you all may recall the CBS head said, I paraphrase, Donald Trump may not be good for the country, but he sure is good for CBS and media, illustrative of the reasonable or the unreasonable desire to put profit before responsibility and restraint. And the other part, to belabor the point, I suppose, Tom, if you're Tucker Carlson or Ann Coulter or many other figures like this, let's stipulate that they believe in what they're doing. It's not bad for their pocketbook either.
Yeah.
But because of the celebrity culture and because we celebrate outrage, or it's so marketable. Could you speak to those potentially contributing factors too? And if there are issues, how do we manage that?
Well, okay, I would push back a little bit on the concept that profit motive explains much of this, because during the post-war period of the 20th century, there was still a profit motive, and media outlets made money and wanted to make money, but you didn't see this kind of dissemination of illiberal thought, and why not? So, but I think what changed was not that all of a sudden illiberal thought what really changed was not the profit motive. What changed was the structure of media. The key thing in the 20th century is that the main mechanisms for disseminating ideas, okay, that you had magazines, you had radio, you had television. All of these forms of media were capital intensive and empowered gatekeepers. Okay, so for instance, you take a look at Bill Buckley. Right, Bill Buckley starts up the National Review to be a platform for conservative thought, which hadn't existed before he started the National Review in 1955. And it gets off to a rocky start, and they say some stupid things, and even early on support segregation. But in pretty short order, Buckley decides, okay, no anti-Semites, the John Birch Society is out, no Ayn Rand, right? No overt racism, right? And he could make that stick. Why? Because if somebody submitted to him an article that fell into one of those categories, he chucked it in the garbage, okay? And it didn't get into the National Review. So that left these, what used to be called right-wing extremists, they left these guys out in the cold, and unless they could start up their own magazines which for the most part, they didn't have the resources to do it, let alone have the resources to start up their own radio stations, television. The structure of the media back then, the capital intensive structure of it, empowered gatekeepers, and they filtered out the garbage, right? And still managed to make plenty of money, okay? Now, with what changed in the 21st century, right, is one, you had a series of shocks to the American political system, starting with 9/11 and the Great Recession and the Second Iraq War. So that shook up faith in the status quo, right? And then you had the development of digital media, and then which meant that all of these groups that were on the outside, right, and couldn't get access to because the media had the gatekeepers were too strong. Now they could disseminate their nasty material to a mass audience, and the mass audience was there partly because of disillusion with status quo politics, and partly because I think, in fact, American politics in many respects has not been functioning terribly effectively to help people who are finding themselves increasingly marginalized economically, including the white working class. And so I think that was the key difference, was the nature of the media, the profit motive, the insanity and the celebration over celebrity status and all the rest of it. All that had been around. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the new media structure, which weakened the gatekeepers, who were the antibodies that kept the illiberal ideas out of the mainstream.
Except, since we're talking about my business as well, if Rupert Murdoch didn't tolerate Tucker Carlson, then he'd be making the same decision that Bill Buckley made. Yeah. I mean, this is a very, it's one thing to sort of think of these, the Daily Stormers and all these other
yes,
as their own little, sort of places where, fish develop, without eyes, and, they're like, those places that are deep under the water somewhere. And then, then you've got Fox News. I want to throw this I apologize, Abby Tucker, I haven't read your book, but I want to throw it to you. I mean, do you see the same food chain or line between Tucker Carlson and that Tom does, and that I suspect I do?
I should take that. No, what I see is there's a conflation in Tom's talk between several different things. There's what I would call populism, which is the appeal to the emotions. which can come from left, from right, and from center. I mean, I live in a small town in Massachusetts that got to the national news recently when our school superintendent canceled Halloween, claiming that it excludes kids from families that don't mark Halloween. Now, I'm Jewish and I don't exactly celebrate Halloween, but my daughter was a bit disappointed and so were her friends. The idea was to create outrage. And obviously the superintendent has some broader political aspirations, and she comes from the liberal. I mean, this appeal for the emotions can come from any direction, and I would call that populism. It's not distinctively illiberal. The opposite of that would be technocratic. And within the liberal spectrum, there's what I would call totalitarianism. These are the Daily Stormer and so on. They're not distinctively illiberal. They are within the liberal broad category, but I would say that these are totalitarians, and that's not new. What is new is the combination of this populism with illiberalism. That is the belief that the state should not be limited by institutions, traditions, laws, and so on. That's absolutism, which doesn't have to go with authoritarianism or democracy. It can go with either of them. So we have democracy, we have populism, we have illiberalism, and that's a new sort of combination. Otherwise, if we put everything, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. If we put all these categories in the same bag, which really corresponds to everything we just don't like, I think we miss some of the analytical force of concepts that are more limited, more narrow, but have much more power. So we avoid deflation by overinflation.
No. Look, I certainly do not include in the category of illiberalism everything I don't like. Okay, there's a lot of stuff I don't like, on the left and on the right. So no, illiberalism is right. I give a very narrow definition of illiberalism. It's the explicit rejection of one or more of the fundamental categories, principles of liberal democracy. Okay, that is new. Okay. Well, we'll put it this way. It's not new in the sense that there was always a very small group, used to be called right-wing extremism. They were out there. They held on by their fingernails. They managed to survive as a kind of a remnant or a groupuscule. Okay. So in one sense, they're not new. What is new is when they got access to the mainstream owing to the political shakeups of the 21st century and to the arrival of new media. So you don't like my contrast of illiberalism with liberal democracy. You want to talk about totalitarianism and populism and liberalism. Well, go ahead. You can use whatever conceptual scheme you want to, but I will not cop to the charge that I've thrown everything I don't like into one basket and called it illiberalism. I do, however, believe that because a vision of political culture and a vision of the ethics of controversy are part of the ideology of liberalism. Okay, liberalism, it wants a tolerant, to sum it up in a word, tolerant political culture and a ethics of controversy based on rational discussion. Okay, so that's one of the principles of illiberalism. That's one of the principles of liberalism. Therefore, if you reject, right, the political culture of tolerance, if you reject the discourse based on reasoned discussion, okay, you are rejecting one of the principles of liberal democracy, and that puts you in the illiberal camp. And therefore, right, that's where I would say that, and of course, I recognize there's a difference in intensity between the Daily Stormer and Fox News, but I do say that the Fox News is what I would, incidentally, I did not count the Fox News websites as part of the hardcore illiberal right. Okay, I still consider them as part of their website, as part of the conventional right. But there's no question that Fox News is influenced, or maybe not knowingly influenced, but they are buying into an ethics of controversy that focuses on calling other people treason, calling other people traitors, fighting, political contests as if it's war. And I believe, that quote that I gave from Anne Coulter, who I would call alt-light, right? All of this indicates that there is a certain commonality between these more popular, more mainstream outlets that communicate the illiberal ideas through a rhetorical strategy. There's a certain connection between them and the more hardcore outlets that I'm also concerned about.
So I would just say that, in Tom's book, he does refer to left-wing illiberal movements.
Yes, which is minute. Yes, there are left-wing illiberal movements. A left-wing illiberal, just like the right, the illiberal right rejects liberal democracy. Yes, there are left-wing movements that reject liberal democracy. There are, Trotskyist organizations, Maoist organizations, anarchist organizations. So yes, I agree. I certainly agree that there is such a thing as a left-wing illiberalism. Okay, how big is the left-wing illiberal movement? Answer: they get about 2.5 million visitors on average a month to their websites. That is compared to 188 million visitors on average a month to the illiberal right sites. So I don't deny that there is a left-wing illiberalism. It's tiny, it's minute. Now, the sort of things you describe, like somebody canceling Halloween because for some crazy reason, people who criticize you when you say, women get pregnant, so there is this kind of extreme political correctness, I grant you, which, is a problem. It's not the problem I'm writing about, okay? And by the way, these people who cancel Halloween, who use terms like pregnant people, who get upset when somebody criticizes their support for Israel. Look, none of these people, now they may be wrong, they may be doing damage, right? They're not fundamentally stepping forward and rejecting liberal democracy, okay? And that's, so I would like to write a book. I hope my next book will be on these, what we would call, extreme political correctness. I think there's a real problem there. I think that extreme political correctness does alienate some people and has to be dealt with. I talk a little bit about this in my book, but it's not, it's a problem, but it's just a problem that I haven't written about in detail.
Hey, Tom and Carla, if I may join again, I'll be very brief. I know Professor Callaway wants to take us to economics. From my concrete understanding, Tom, how do issues like abortion, gay marriage, and LGBTQ plus rights, immigration and immigration restrictionism and identity politics, how do they fit definitionally into your view of what is liberal and illiberal?
Okay, I think, let's talk about identity politics. We have to distinguish between different types of identity politics, okay? You have the identity politics of groups like Black Lives Matter, of the National Organization for Women, of La Raza, but by the way, I think La Raza doesn't call itself La Raza anymore. I think it calls itself something like Estamos Unidos or whatever. But what these groups are, right? These are relatively new potential interest groups organizing, right, to get a piece of the pie like any other interest group. Okay, so and these sorts of groups, interest groups that organize not on the basis of the source of their income, but organize on the basis of things like their sex or gender or ethnicity or race. Right? These groups are not fundamentally any different from the kinds of interest groups that Madison talks about in Federalist 10. They're different, and they're new groups, but they're just, in my view, they're just another sort of interest group, and none of them explicitly reject liberal democracy. You know, I'll read you another juicy quote that I think is highly relevant. Black Lives Matter says, here's a key quote. If I can't put my finger right on it, but the essence of it is, we are unapologetically Black, right? But however, loving our own people is necessary if we are going to love and care about other people. So that is not an expression of a rejection of liberal democracy. Whatever, you could say anything you want to about Black Lives Matter and what they think about police policy and so forth. They're just another interest group that is not rejecting liberal democracy. So those interest groups, welcome aboard. Right? They don't represent a fundamental challenge to the liberal political order. Now, then there's something different. There's an illiberal form of identity politics, which you could call identitarianism. Okay, and the most, you know, the most explicit expositors of this line of thought are people associated with the European New Right, people like Benoit and Guillaume Fay, right? And they boldly step forward and say, you know, that, hey, your identity is based on your race, and your race and your identity create an entire cultural and epistemological bubble, right? Which makes it impossible for different racial groups to communicate with each other. And so the result is either when these monadic, these bubbleized racial groups, when they meet, they necessarily go to war because they don't understand each other and can't communicate. So either politics is all about racial war, or you have to maintain strict isolationism. So that form of identity politics, the illiberal form of identity politics, the identitarian form of identity politics, that is a very serious challenge to liberal democracy. Let me just say one more thing. I know my wife always tells me not to talk too long, but I just want to get one other thing in. There is a third type of illiberal politics. And what is that? Well, does everybody realize that empirical research has demonstrated that there are a set of ideas which are very broadly accepted by most interest groups in the United States? There is an American identity that has been identified by empirical research, mostly by Deborah Schildkraut. And she has found that the basic concepts of liberalism, right, which you're familiar with, civic republicanism, which is the kind of community activism that Tocqueville wrote about, incorporationism, which is, hey, we Americans, we absorb many different groups, and unfortunately, ethnoculturalism, which can be a form of racism. Those four bundles of ideas are part of the American identity. So I conclude there is a healthy form of identity politics available to Americans, right? It represents a celebration of the American identity, and you can use the assumptions, these widely shared assumptions, so that you can so that we can reach out to new groups and and demonstrate that the rising influence of minorities, of Blacks, of women, of new immigrant groups, we can demonstrate that they share many of the ideas that are explicit in the American identity, and we can try to interpret the changes that are the demographic changes we're going through as being consistent with this widely shared American identity.
Thank you. I was going to ask the prescriptions, but we have a limited amount of time, and you sum that up. That's a challenging and interesting concept, because we usually use identity in a pejorative term way these days. Professor Callaway, do you want to give your question rather than just having it in chat? I much prefer when people voice their questions. Professor Callaway still with us? Perhaps not.
Oh, there he goes.
Here he is.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Just talk loud.
Okay, for Professor Mink, do you believe in general terms that the serious economic disadvantages to the lower middle class of the sort which arose from neoliberal globalization and digitalization tend to evoke authoritarian or illiberal consequences?
Yes, absolutely. This is something I go into another part of the book. Listen, America, I love the study of government, and in a certain sense, you know, I love, this is perverse to say I love American government and love reading about it, but hey, listen, American government is not effectively delivering public goods and vital services to the whole of the population, right? Why is that? We could go into it. We have a highly fragmented, hyper-fragmented political system that tends to veer into a gridlock and sclerosis, okay? And so when you have a situation where, for instance, I think you make an excellent point with the impact of neoliberal trade policy, right? See, you know, it sounds great. Hey, let's have free trade, okay? And yes, right, that will impact the American automobile industry and the workers for it negatively. You know, they might be thrown out of jobs, but we can demonstrate, you know, microeconomically that there'll be a net gain to the economy as a result of free trade. And we can therefore take some of the gains that are produced by free trade and redistribute them to the losers. And as a result, we can all come out ahead through free trade. The only, sounds great, right? Sounds like a miracle, right? That the only problem with this is we have such a fragmented political system that it's much easier to bestow benefits than to redistribute benefits. So all of the groups that stand to gain from free trade, right? They organize, they fight, they get their free trade, and they say they get their free trade, and they say, oh yeah, sure, yeah, there'll be redistribution, right. We'll talk about that the next time around, right? And of course, the next time around never happens, or it never happens very seriously. So I certainly agree. Listen, to deal with this problem and to deal with the problems of the working class, the middle class, and so forth. Who, by the way, recently I was teaching my students. And I was explaining to them the meaning of anti-Semitism as socialism for idiots. Right? I basically agree with that formulation, with the idea being that, hey, if you were being screwed over, you have lost your good job, and so right and so forth. If you're sophisticated, you will organize and fight for progressive or broadly defined policies to help you. If you're not so sophisticated, you're likely to say, oh, it's the Jews, right? And so, yes, I certainly believe that the combination of neoliberal policies and a sclerotic political system that makes redistribution, that the redistribution that's necessary to get people to buy into such policies, you put them together, and yes, you will create an audience and a movement for illiberalism.
Okay, well, would you agree to that lacking an external enemy as we had in the Cold War, that the politics necessary for this redistribution is sort of idealistic? It's impractical. It's not going to happen. It seems to me that the fragmentation is, in a sense, the natural state, or a more natural state, lacking this external enemy.
I wouldn't quite put it that way. I would say that,
changes.
Go ahead.
The politics changes.
Yeah. Well, I would say it wasn't so much the lack, the external enemy. I mean, I think that after World War II, which was, of course, a tremendous governmental success, right? After World War II, you had a series of successes in government, which, you know, like the thing, even including things, intangible sorts of things like the moonshot, but you also had the civil rights movement, and, you know, and so forth. So government was functioning, and people could say, hey, you know, okay, you know, why do I want to rebel against the system? A system is basically working. As the system became more sclerotic, as some of the problems that were not addressed as a result of the fragmentation of the American political system, as they built up and built up and built up, eventually people started being attracted to extremist ideas. And so you say it's going to be impossible to put together a political movement that is going to fight to change these policies. I don't share your pessimism. I do think we need a realigning political election, okay? Something on the level of like 1964, right? Big enough to create a strong enough unified government to amend the Constitution and remove some of its most fragmenting aspects. And I think we need people like Stacey Abrams to fight the long march, right, and turn red states blue. And I also think this is where Mr. Tucker, I think I can say something that might appeal to you. I think it's very important, right, to not paint the effort to put together a new progressive movement, broadly speaking. It's important not to frame that as an example of the new America, right? Finally, coming into its own and, putting the old America, putting them back on its heels. I think, the whole concept of a book that says like brown is the new white, and which contains some good political analysis, that's certainly not the way you want to put things, right? What has to happen is there's work for intellectuals, public intellectuals, to take the changes, the inevitable changes that the American society is going through, and take the hard political work that needs to be done to put together a broadly speaking and not heavily ideological political movement that intellectuals have to work to explain and interpret these developments as being consistent with the positive elements of American identity. And I think, therefore, there is a battle of ideas to be fought, and that is how I hope, knock on wood, we'll put together a movement that will bring about the changes that are necessary to improve the quality of government and bring the working class, bring the white middle class, firmly back into the small d democratic fold.
Tom, thank you so much, and thank you. It's 1 o'clock. I'm going to pass it back to Jeff, but I mean, one of the things I think we're doing here at American Purpose actually is to trying to bring people together around a strong American identity that believes in free discourse and the fundamental ideas of the United States. So I get more hopeful when I hang around with people at American Purpose, and most of the time I live in despair. So with that, I turn it back to Jeff.
Well, dear Carla, we're all inspired and it's all aspirational when we're hanging around with you. Believe me, thank you all. It's an hour well spent, always for me. A stimulating book and a good author. How can you beat an hour like that? I feel richer, and I found this conversation constructive and interesting. Carla, you are the moderator par excellence. Tip of hat. Gratitude. And Tom, congratulations on your book, Brookings 2021. You have a lot you're putting on the table. I hope it does well and stirs lots of debate. So Carla, Tom, and everybody who spent the hour with us, warmest thanks. Have a good afternoon, good evening.
My thanks to Carla, to Jeffrey, to American Purpose, and everybody. Thanks so much for this great opportunity.
Thanks, Avi, for that. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.